when a man in worn-out jeans and dusty boots sat down on a concrete curb outside one of the most famous movie studios in the world, nobody gave him a second look. He wasn't making noise. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just sitting there, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands, staring quietly at the ground like a man with a lot on his mind. A security guard walked over, looked him up and down, and told him to move along. The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't say a single word to defend himself. He just stood up slowly, picked up his coffee, walked 12 feet to the left, and sat back down on the curb just outside the gate. Like it was no big deal, like he had nowhere better to be. And for the next 15 minutes, hundreds of people walked past him. Assistants with lanyards around their necks, delivery drivers, producers in nice cars. Every single one of them looked right through him, the way people look through someone they have already decided doesn't matter. Then a black SUV came screaming into the parking lot. The back door flew open, before the car even fully stopped. A man in a half-buttoned blazer jumped out, looked around the lot with wild eyes, spotted the figure on the curb, and ran. Actually ran. Arms pumping, shoes slapping the asphalt, nearly tripping over a cable wire stretched across the ground. "Mr. Reeves!" he shouted, completely out of breath. "Mr. Reeves, I am so deeply sorry." The security guard who had told the man to move along slowly turned around. His stomach dropped straight through the floor. Because the man on the curb, the one in the worn jeans and the dusty boots, the one nobody had looked at twice, the one he had told to move along like he was nobody, was one of the most famous actors on the planet. And what happened next, what that actor did and said in the minutes that followed, and what it quietly set in motion for three very different people whose lives were about to change forever, is one of the most remarkable things you will ever hear about a human being. Stay with us for the whole story, because the part that will really get you isn't the curb. It isn't even the producer running across the parking lot. It's what we found out later. A secret connection buried 20 years in the past that nobody in that parking lot knew existed. That makes this story something you are going to want to tell someone else the moment it's over. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2006. A man in worn jeans, a faded jacket, and old boots sat alone on a concrete step outside Paramount Studios on Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles. He had a paper coffee cup in his hands. His hair was long and messy. He wasn't making noise. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just sitting there, looking at the ground like a man with a lot on his mind. Security guard Darnell Hutchins walked over. He looked the man up and down the way people do when they've already made up their mind. "Sir, this area is for studio personnel only. You can't loiter here." The man looked up. His eyes were calm and dark and very still. He nodded once. "Sure. Sorry about that." No argument, no attitude. He stood up slowly, picked up his coffee, and walked to the edge of the gate. Then he sat down again, this time on the curb, just outside the white line that marked studio property. Darnell watched him for a moment. Then he went back to his post. 15 minutes passed. Then a black SUV came flying into the lot, tires barking against the asphalt. Before it fully stopped, the back door swung open, and a man in a half-buttoned blazer jumped out. Producer Marcus Webb. He stood in the middle of the parking lot, head turning left and right, like a man who had lost something he could not afford to lose. He spotted the figure on the curb. He ran. Actually ran. Arms pumping, blazer flapping, nearly catching his shoe on a thick cable wire that ran across the asphalt. "Mr. Reeves," he called out, voice cracking with breathlessness. "Mr. Reeves, I am so deeply sorry." Darnell Hutchins turned around. The man on the curb was Keanu Reeves. He was sitting with a paper coffee cup between both hands, looking up at Marcus Webb with an expression so calm it almost didn't belong in Los Angeles. Darnell felt the ground shift under him. And what happened next changed three lives forever. To understand why Keanu Reeves sat quietly on that curb without saying a single word, without calling his publicist, without filming a video, without telling Darnell Hutchins exactly who he was, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to Hollywood, not to fame, not to the Matrix or the red carpets or the magazine covers. You have to go back to Beirut, Lebanon, in September 1964, where a baby boy came into the world in a city that was still beautiful before it broke. His mother was a young British woman with red hair and quick eyes. His father was a man who smiled like he meant it and left like he didn't. Samuel Nowlin Reeves Jr. was Keanu's father. People who knew him said he was charming the way a summer storm is charming, bright and loud and gone before you finish looking at it. He did not stay. When Keanu was just 3 years old, Samuel walked out. He eventually ended up in Hawaii, where he was later convicted on drug charges and sent to prison. He was not there for Keanu's first day of school. He was not there for any of the days that came after. He was simply not there. And for a small child, not there does not stay a fact. It becomes a feeling. It becomes the wallpaper of every room you grow up in. His mother, Patricia Taylor, was made of different material. She was British-born, resilient, and deeply committed to keeping her children alive, even when the ground kept moving under her feet. She packed up Keanu and his sister and moved, first to Sydney, Australia, a city of wide skies and warm water that should have felt like a fresh start, but mostly felt like another place where Keanu didn't know anyone. Then to New York City, with its noise and its cold and its sidewalks that never quite forgave you for being slow. Then, finally, to Toronto, Canada, which would become the closest thing to a hometown Keanu ever had, though even that came with conditions. By the time he was a teenager, Keanu had attended 4 different high schools, 4 sets of first days, 4 cafeterias where he didn't know where to sit, 4 teachers who didn't know his name yet, 4 chances to start over that each felt, in their own way, like starting from less than zero. Toronto was where the shape of things became clearer. School was hard, not because Keanu was careless, but because the words on the page didn't behave the way they behaved for everyone else. Dyslexia made reading feel like trying to catch smoke. Letters moved, sentences blurred. Some teachers were patient, some were not. Some classmates understood, most did not. There is a particular kind of cruelty that children reserve for the kid who reads out loud slowly, and Keanu knew it well. He found 2 things that helped. The first was ice hockey. He was good, genuinely good, playing goalie for a local team with a focus and a stillness between the pipes that made coaches take notice. In goal, you are alone in a way that is also powerful. You are the last line. You are still while everything rushes at you, and your job is not to panic. Keanu was very good at not panicking. The second thing was acting. He didn't find it so much as fall into it. A drama class, a school production, a moment when he stepped onto a small wooden stage in a gymnasium, and something locked into place. A teacher named Mr. Colin Farber at the Etobicoke School of the Arts saw it before Keanu did. Farber was the kind of teacher who paid attention to what students did with silence, not just with words. After a rehearsal one afternoon, he kept Keanu back and said something that would stay with him longer than any school lesson. "You don't perform," Farber told him, leaning against the edge of the stage. "You become. That's not something I can teach. That's rare." Keanu didn't have words for what that landed like. He had been called difficult, distracted, spacey, slow. He had been the kid told to sit in the front row so the teacher could keep an eye on him, which is just a polite way of saying the teacher didn't trust him to keep up. Nobody had ever used the word rare about him before. Nobody had ever looked at the quiet inside him and called it a gift instead of a problem. He was 15 when he got his first small commercial in Canada. 17. When he made the decision that made Patricia go pale at the kitchen table. He was moving to Los Angeles, alone, to become an actor. He had almost nothing: a motorcycle, a duffel bag, a name that nobody in Hollywood could pronounce correctly on the first try. No connections, no family in the industry, no safety net of any kind stretched beneath him. What he had, what he didn't even know he had yet, was something that can't be taught in any acting school or bought with any amount of money. It was the patience of a person who has spent their entire childhood waiting for something that never came, waiting for his father to walk back through the door, waiting to feel like he belonged somewhere, waiting for someone to look at him long enough to see what Mr. Farber had seen. That kind of waiting changes a person from the inside out. It either makes you desperate and loud, grabbing at every chance to prove your worth, or it makes you still, deeply, powerfully still. The kind of still that looks like nothing is happening until everything is. Keanu became still, and that stillness, that particular, private, hard-won stillness, was the exact thing that kept him sitting calmly on a curb outside Paramount Studios on a Tuesday morning in March 2006, holding a paper cup of coffee, saying nothing, bothering no one, waiting without complaint while the world moved around him at its usual careless speed. He didn't tell Darnell Hutchins his name. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't make a scene. He had been on that curb before, in different cities, at different ages, in different kinds of cold. A curb outside a Hollywood studio was just the latest version of a very old feeling. But this time, for the first time in a very long time, the wait was about to end differently. He rode into Los Angeles on a motorcycle, with a duffel bag strapped to the back, and exactly the kind of hope that cities like this one are specifically designed to crush. It was 1986. Keanu Reeves was 21 years old. He had no agent, no manager, no cousin who knew somebody who knew somebody. He had a Canadian accent that casting directors would later ask him to soften, a name that made people pause with their pen over the clipboard, and a face that didn't fit cleanly into any of the boxes that Hollywood liked to check in those days. Not quite the all-American boy. Not quite anything they had a folder for. He found an apartment in the Los Feliz neighborhood, a part of East Los Angeles, that sat quietly between the loud money of Hollywood and the working reality of everything else. The apartment was small, and it was cheap, and it was his, which made it the best place he had ever lived. He bought groceries from a corner store on Vermont Avenue. He learned which diners gave the biggest portions for the least money. He took the kind of jobs that young men take in Los Angeles when they are waiting for their real life to begin. Kitchen work, some delivery runs, occasional labor on construction crews where nobody asked about your resume and the pay came in cash at the end of the day. He went to auditions. He was rejected at most of them. The rejection in Hollywood is rarely loud or honest. Nobody screams at you. Nobody tells you to go home and give up. What they do is quieter, and in some ways harder to survive. They smile at you in the waiting room. They say your name correctly, or close enough. They ask you to read a few lines, and they nod while you do it. And then they say, "Thank you so much," in a voice that means nothing at all. And you walk back out through the glass door into the California sunshine, and you don't know if you were brilliant or terrible, because nobody in that room will ever tell you. You just wait for a phone call that doesn't come. Casting directors in that era said things about Keanu in the rooms he wasn't allowed inside. That his eyes were too still, that he didn't project enough hunger, that he was hard to read. The last one was meant as a criticism. It was actually the most accurate thing anyone in Hollywood ever said about him, and they had no idea it was a compliment. He did not quit. In 1986, he landed a small role in Youngblood, a hockey film that let him play something close to himself, a Canadian kid on the ice who was better than people expected. It wasn't a big break. It was a small crack in a very thick wall. Then came scattered television appearances. Then, in 1989, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure opened in theaters, and suddenly, Keanu Reeves was a name that teenagers across America knew how to say. He was 24 years old, and famous in the particular way that comedic roles make you famous. People loved the character more than they saw the actor, which is its own kind of invisible. But here is the part of the story that gets left out of the profiles and the tribute videos and the carefully arranged magazine interviews. Fame did not make Keanu safe. In some ways, it made him more exposed. Because now there were more people watching, which meant more people deciding what he was and what he wasn't. A senior executive at a major studio, someone whose name appears on the posters of films you have definitely seen, reportedly said in a private meeting in the early 1990s that Keanu was a prop, not a performer. This was said in a room full of people. Some of them nodded. None of them pushed back. The executive would go on to have a long and celebrated career. Keanu would go on to outlast him by every meaningful measure, but that is not the point. The point is that the room nodded. There were projects he was passed over for quietly, meetings that were booked and then canceled the morning of, phone calls that went to his manager instead of to him, which in Hollywood is the polite way of saying, the conversation you are about to have is not one we want to have with your face in the room. The industry had a version of Keanu that it had decided on, and it was not particularly interested in revising that version just because the evidence kept suggesting it was wrong. Through all of it, through the rejections and the whispered criticisms and the years when the work was inconsistent and the future felt genuinely uncertain, Keanu Reeves did not become mean. This is the thing that is hardest to explain and most important to understand. The entertainment industry is very good at making kind people into careful people. Careful with their words. Careful with their trust. Careful in the way that people become when they have been hurt enough times that openness starts to feel like a liability. You see it everywhere in Hollywood. The managed smiles. The publicist-approved answers. The eyes that have learned to calculate before they connect. Keanu never fully made that turn. He tipped generously at restaurants where he wasn't recognized. He remembered the names of crew members on sets where the director didn't. He stopped for fans, not because his team told him it was good for his image, but because the fans were human beings standing in front of him, and it would have felt wrong not to stop. Small things, ordinary things. The kinds of things that don't end up in columns or generate headlines. But the decade of the 1990s would ask much more of him than career uncertainty. It would reach into the part of his life that had nothing to do with film sets or box office numbers or what any executive thought of him in any room. It would reach into the place where he was not a movie star at all, where he was just a man. And it would take things from him that no amount of patience could have prepared him for. The curb he had survived as a child, the one made of absence and loneliness, and a father who chose to disappear, was about to become something heavier, something that would have broken a different person entirely. But that is the next chapter, and it is not an easy one. Word count. Chapter 2. 480 words. Some losses arrive with warning, a doctor's face before he speaks, a phone that rings too late at night, a silence that stretches 1 second too long before someone finds the words. And some losses arrive the way December does, quietly, without asking permission, settling over everything before you realize the warmth is already gone. For Keanu Reeves, the 1990s arrived like that second kind. By 1994, he was undeniable. Speed opened in June of that year and made over $350 million worldwide. He was 30 years old, running alongside a bus that couldn't slow down, and the whole world was watching. Critics who had spent years dismissing him as a pretty face with limited range were suddenly writing new sentences. Studios that had passed on him were making calls. The machine of Hollywood, which had once looked at him like an interesting but inconvenient puzzle, decided it was time to solve him in a different direction, toward blockbusters, toward action, toward the version of Keanu that could carry a summer film on his name alone. He let them think it was their idea. Underneath all of it, underneath the premieres and the profile pieces, and the motorcycle rides through the canyon roads above Malibu, Keanu was living a private life, that the cameras never fully reached. And in that private life, he met someone. Jennifer Syme was not a movie star. She was a personal assistant and aspiring filmmaker, a young woman from the San Fernando Valley, with dark humor and an enormous laugh, and the particular kind of bravery that comes from having nothing to prove. She and Keanu found each other in the mid-1990s, in the quiet spaces between events and sets, and all the noise that surrounds a famous person's life. What grew between them was real, in the way that things are real when they happen away from cameras, tender and specific, and not designed for anyone else's consumption. By 1999, Jennifer was pregnant. They were expecting a daughter. They had chosen a name, Ava Archer Syme Reeves. And there is something about the choosing of a name that makes a person real before they arrive. You say the name in empty rooms. You think it in traffic. It becomes the shape of a future you are already living inside of, in the quiet part of your heart, where hope lives before it has to prove itself. Ava was stillborn on December 24, 1999, Christmas Eve. She arrived and did not stay, and the name that had been a future became instead the outline of an absence so complete and so specific that there is no clean way to write about it. Keanu was 35 years old. He had spent his entire life learning to carry absence. He had thought he understood what loss felt like. He had not understood. Not yet. Not like this. He and Jennifer separated not long after. Grief does that sometimes. It bonds people, and it breaks them simultaneously, and there is no predicting which direction it will pull until you are already inside it. They remained connected. They cared for each other across the distance that loss had carved between them. Then on April 2, 2001, Jennifer Syme died. She lost control of her car on Cahuenga Boulevard in Los Angeles in the early hours of the morning. The car left the road and struck several parked vehicles. She was 28 years old. She died at the scene before anyone could reach her. Keanu was 36. His daughter had been gone for 16 months. Now Jennifer was gone too, and the city of Los Angeles, the city he had ridden into on a motorcycle at 21, with a duffel bag and enough hope to fill a room, was now the city that held both of their absences on streets he still had to drive. He did not give a public statement. He did not call a press conference. He did not go on a talk show and cry in a chair while a host handed him tissues and the audience felt better for having witnessed it. He did what he had always done with the hardest things. He went quiet. He went inward. And then, when enough time had passed, he went back to work. Because work was the one place where the hours had a shape. Where someone told you where to stand and what time to arrive and what the next scene required. Where the structure of other people's stories gave you somewhere to put yourself when your own story felt too heavy to carry without a blueprint. This is the man who walked through the Melrose Avenue gate at Paramount Studios in 2006. Not just the actor, not just the name on the poster. The man who had buried a daughter on Christmas Eve and lost a love on a boulevard he passed every few weeks. The man who had grown up without a father in cities that didn't know his name. The man who had been told he was a prop and a distraction and not enough, and had outlasted every single person who said it. And now we arrive at Darnell Hutchins. Darnell was 44 years old in March 2006. He had worked the Melrose Avenue gate at Paramount Studios for 11 years, longer than some of the executives inside had held their titles. He was good at his job in the specific way that people are good at things they have chosen to take seriously when the world gave them no particular reason to. He memorized faces the way some people memorize song lyrics, effortlessly, completely, without trying. He knew which cars belonged to which departments. He knew the delivery schedules and the shooting calendars, and which days the talent arrived through the side entrance to avoid the fan clusters that gathered on Melrose with their phones and their handmade signs. He had grown up in Compton. His father had spent 30 years at a tire shop on Wilmington Avenue, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and a quietness that Darnell had once mistaken for sadness, and later understood was dignity. His mother cleaned office buildings downtown 3 nights a week and still made breakfast every morning before Darnell left for school. He had tried to become a police officer in his 20s, studied for the exam, passed the written portion, failed the physical after a knee injury from a basketball game that tore something that never fully healed. He did not complain about this. He found the next path, and he walked it. Security work at a major film studio was not a small thing, not from where Darnell stood. He had clearance to a world that millions of people paid money to glimpse from the outside. He understood that, and he was grateful for it, in the quiet, daily way that people are grateful for things they worked to earn. On the morning of March 14, 2006, Darnell arrived at Gate 2 at 6:45 a.m. His shift started at 7. He liked coming early. He would pour a coffee from the machine in the lobby, read whatever section of the Los Angeles Times he had folded into his jacket pocket, and let the shift settle over him like a second skin before the traffic of the morning began. By 8:15, the lot was filling up. Delivery vans, assistant directors with lanyards around their necks, moving at a speed that suggested every minute was already behind schedule. A catering truck for Stage 8, the regular rhythm of a studio Tuesday in early spring. And then a man on the steps near Gate 2 who didn't belong to any of it. Darnell had seen this before. People who drifted toward the gate with a kind of magnetic hope, as if being physically close to where films were made might somehow accelerate whatever dream they were carrying. Background actors waiting on an unofficial callback. Film students who had talked their way to the sidewalk and then didn't know what to do next. Occasionally, someone in genuine distress, confused or lost or needing to be pointed gently in another direction. The man on the steps fit none of those categories exactly. He was still and composed. He held a paper coffee cup from the cart vendor on the sidewalk outside the gate, Miguel's cart, which had been there so long it had become an informal landmark. He was wearing jeans and boots and a jacket that had seen better years. His dark hair was long and unbrushed. He was looking at the pavement with the expression of a man who was thinking something very far away from where he was sitting. Darnell approached the way he always did, professional, direct, not unkind, because unkind was never the point. "Sir, this area is for studio personnel only. You can't loiter here." The man looked up. His eyes were dark and extraordinarily calm. Not the calm of someone who didn't understand the situation. The calm of someone who had sat in harder places than this and knew that making a scene would not improve any of them. "Sure," he said. "Sorry about that." He stood. He picked up his coffee. He walked to the edge of the driveway, to the curb just beyond the white line that marked the boundary of studio property, and he sat down again. Darnell noted it, gave it another 10 seconds of attention, decided the man was harmless and probably waiting on a call that would redirect him elsewhere. He turned and went back to his post. He did not know that the visitor log for the 9 a.m. meeting in Building 6 had a clerical error on it, a transposed letter in the last name that had kicked the entry out of the confirmed list. He did not know that the man on the curb had arrived early, as he always did, been told politely that his name wasn't showing, and had said no problem and stepped outside rather than make anyone scramble. He did not know that the man had taken the metro from his house that morning, had transferred at the Hollywood and Vine station, had walked the last several blocks because he liked seeing the city from street level, liked the way Los Angeles looked before it fully woke up, liked the specific light of an early March morning in a place where the seasons change so quietly you had to pay attention to notice. He did not know any of this. He knew only what he could see, and what he could see was a man on a curb with a paper cup of coffee who had been asked to move and had moved without argument. Darnell Hutchins was not a cruel man. He was not a careless man. He was a man doing his job in the only direction the information available to him pointed. But information is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is not the same as seeing. And in 11 years of working that gate, Darnell Hutchins had learned to process people in seconds. Category, threat level, belong or doesn't belong. Because that was what the job required. Efficiency, pattern recognition, quick reads. He had read this one wrong. Not because he was a bad person, because the man on the curb looked nothing like what the world had told Darnell a movie star was supposed to look like when they showed up. And in that gap, between what the world teaches us to expect and what is actually standing in front of us, entire lives get misread. This one was about to be corrected, loudly, breathlessly, by a producer in a half-buttoned blazer running across a parking lot like his career depended on it. Which, in a way, it did. Marcus Webb did not consider himself the kind of man who panicked. He had built an entire professional identity around not panicking. In 30 years of Hollywood production, 30 years of budget overruns and lead actors with sudden creative differences, and studio heads who changed their minds between Tuesday and Thursday without explanation, Marcus had developed a particular skill for making chaos look managed. He spoke slowly in meetings where everyone else was speaking fast. He used silence as punctuation. He had a leather chair in his second-floor office on the Paramount lot that he had owned for 19 years, and the chair had a way of making whoever sat across from it feel that everything was under control. He was not sitting in that chair right now. Right now, Marcus Webb was standing in the middle of a parking lot in a blazer he had not finished buttoning, breathing in a way that suggested his gym membership was more aspirational than practical, staring at a man on a curb who was holding a paper coffee cup with both hands, and looking back at him with an expression of complete and slightly amused calm. Let's go back 11 minutes. At 8:47 a.m., on March 14, 2006, Marcus was in his office reviewing a revised budget breakdown for the lake house, when his assistant Brianna Cho knocked twice and opened the door in the same motion, which was the knock she used when what she was about to say could not wait for an answer. Brianna was 29 years old, had a master's degree in film studies from USC, and had been running Marcus's professional life with the kind of quiet precision that the entertainment industry consistently underpaid and rarely acknowledged. She kept his calendar the way an air traffic controller keeps a runway. Nothing landed or departed without her knowing about it first, and collisions were simply not permitted, which was why the look on her face when she opened that door stopped Marcus mid-sentence. "Keanu Reeves is not in the building," she said. Marcus set down the budget pages. "His meeting is at 9. "He's not in the building," she said again. And the repetition was its own kind of alarm, because Brianna did not repeat herself without reason. The story came out in pieces over the next 45 seconds. The visitor log error, the transposed letter, the gate system kicking the name off the confirmed list, the security officer at Gate 2 who had followed protocol exactly as written, the part where Keanu Reeves had said no problem and stepped outside rather than escalate the situation in any direction. Marcus stared at her for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment. Then he stood up from the leather chair and walked around his desk at a speed that was not yet running, but was already committed to becoming it. His coffee mug was on the corner of the desk. His elbow caught it on the way past. It went over the edge and hit the floor, and spread across the pale carpet in a shape that Brianna would later describe at industry dinners for years to come as looking almost exactly like the state of Florida. She did not try to stop him. She understood that some situations required the body to move before the mind had finished processing, and this was one of them. Marcus went through the door, down the hall at a pace that made 2 junior development assistants flatten themselves against the wall to let him pass. He jabbed the elevator button, waited 1 full second, decided 1 second was too long, pushed through the door to the stairwell, and took the stairs down to the lobby in a rhythm that was somewhere between a fast walk and a controlled fall forward. Through the lobby, past the security desk, where a guard named Phil Okafor looked up and opened his mouth and closed it again, sensing correctly that whatever he was about to say was not going to be useful right now. Through the glass door, into the California morning, which was clear and cool and completely indifferent to the urgency of the situation. Across the parking lot, past a catering truck, past a cluster of production assistants who parted around him like water around a stone. Nearly, very nearly, catching the toe of his right shoe on the thick rubber cable that ran across the asphalt from the generator to stage 7. He stumbled, recovered, kept moving. And there, at the edge of the gate, sitting on the curb in the March morning light, was Keanu Reeves, still, composed, paper coffee cup between both hands, looking up at Marcus with an expression that contained, in equal measure, warmth and the specific patience of a man who had been waiting his whole life for things to work themselves out, and had made a kind of peace with the waiting. Mr. Reeves. Marcus was breathing hard. He was aware of how he looked. Blazer half-buttoned, face flushed, the physical evidence of panic written all over him in a way that his leather chair and his slow, careful voice had spent years carefully concealing. "I am so deeply sorry. There was an error on the visitor log, a clerical mistake. Your name wasn't showing on the gate system and nobody caught it until..." Keanu stood up from the curb. He was unhurried about it, the way a man stands up when he has been sitting comfortably and is in no particular rush to be anywhere else. He extended his hand. "Marcus," he said. His voice was even and warm. "Good morning, beautiful day." Marcus shook the hand, still catching his breath, still processing the fact that one of the most famous actors in the world had just been sitting on a public curb outside his studio for the better part of 20 minutes because of a letter transposed in a database, and was now greeting him the way you greet a friend at a farmer's market. He started to apologize again. Keanu stopped him with a small, unhurried gesture, not dismissive, but definitive. "Please don't," Keanu said. He glanced down at the coffee cup in his other hand. "I had good coffee, some time to think. The light out here is nice in the morning." He looked up at Marcus with a half-smile that carried no edge and no performance. "That's not a bad morning." Marcus Webb would say, in a conversation with a colleague several months later, that he had spent 3 decades in the entertainment industry meeting famous people in varying states of entitlement, anxiety, manufactured warmth, and strategic humility. He had seen every performance a famous person could put on when they were trying to manage how they were perceived. He said he had no framework for what he was looking at on that curb, because Keanu Reeves was not performing graciousness. He was not strategically choosing patience as a way to make Marcus feel small by comparison, which was its own Hollywood maneuver that Marcus had seen many times. He was not storing this moment away to mention later at a dinner party as evidence of how grounded he was. He simply meant it. The coffee was good. The morning light was nice. A mistake had happened, and it had resolved itself, and now it was time to go inside and talk about a movie. That was all. They walked back through the gate together. Darnell Hutchins was at his post as they passed. Marcus was already talking about the meeting, about the script revisions, about the director's latest notes. Keanu was listening, actually listening, not the nodding performance of listening that fills most professional conversations, but the real kind, where the eyes are present and the other person can feel the attention landing. Darnell watched them walk through. He watched Keanu Reeves pass through the gate that he had, 20 minutes earlier, redirected to the curb. He would later say that Keanu did not look at him with any particular expression as he passed. No glare, no pointed acknowledgement, no forgiving nod that would have been its own kind of punishment. He just walked through, like a man who had already let it go before it had the chance to become something he needed to carry. Darnell stood at his post until they disappeared through the door of Building 6. Then he stood there a little longer, thinking about the difference between what something looks like and what it is, thinking about a man in worn boots and a faded jacket who had been asked to move and had simply moved, without anger, without argument, without any need at all to prove to a security guard on a Tuesday morning in March that he was worth more than the curb he was sitting on, because he already knew he was. And somehow, In a way, Darnell Hutchins would spend weeks trying to find the right words for that knowing, that quiet and unperformable knowing, was the most powerful thing he had ever seen walk through his gate. Darnell Hutchins drove home that evening on the 110 South, the way he drove it every night. Windows down, radio low. The freeway moving in that strange cooperative way it sometimes did after 6 o'clock, when the worst of the rush had dissolved and Los Angeles briefly remembered how to breathe. But his mind was not on the drive. It was on the curb, on the paper coffee cup, on the dark, calm eyes that had looked up at him without heat or accusation. On the way, a man who could have ended Darnell's career with a single phone call had instead stood up quietly and moved 12 feet to the left and waited like it was the most natural thing in the world. He pulled into the driveway of the house he and his wife Charlene had owned for 9 years in Inglewood. A pale yellow house with a concrete porch and a lemon tree in the front yard that produced more lemons than 2 people could ever use, which meant the neighbors were always well supplied. He sat in the car for a moment after the engine went off. Just sitting, the way he sometimes did when the day had given him something he hadn't finished processing yet. Charlene knew the sitting. She gave it its space. When he finally came inside, she was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a paperback mystery novel she had been reading in the same relaxed, unhurried way she did most things. She looked up. She read his face the way only someone who has shared a house with a person for 19 years can read a face. Not the surface of it, but the weather underneath. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. He sat down across from her and told her the whole thing. The man on the steps, the worn boots and the faded jacket, the paper coffee cup, the way he had said sure, sorry about that without a trace of resentment, and moved to the curb, the black SUV. Marcus Webb running across the parking lot like a man chasing something he was terrified of losing. The name that had stopped Darnell's chest mid-breath. Charlene listened without interrupting, which was one of the great and underrated things about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him with the expression she wore when she was about to say something true that he needed to hear, and she was deciding how directly to say it. "You told Keanu Reeves to move along," she said. "I didn't know," Darnell said. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She set down her tea. She reached across to her laptop, which lived permanently open on the end of the kitchen table, and she began to type. Not to make him feel worse, but because Charlene had always believed that the antidote to not knowing something was to find out, and she saw in her husband's face a man who genuinely needed to understand who had sat on that curb this morning. What came up on that screen in the kitchen of a pale yellow house in Inglewood on the evening of March 14, 2006, was not a filmography. It was not a list of box office numbers or award nominations or the kind of measurable Hollywood achievement that gets engraved on plaques and mentioned in press releases. It was a collection of stories, quiet ones, the kind that travel not through publicists or press junkets, but through the slow and reliable current of people telling other people what they witnessed with their own eyes. There was the story from the set of The Devil's Advocate in 1997, the stunt coordinators and physical effects crew, the people who make the dangerous things look real, who absorb the physical cost of every action sequence so that the actor doesn't have to, were told that Christmas bonuses had been cut from the production budget, a standard cost-saving measure, the kind of decision made in a spreadsheet by someone who has never met the people the numbers represent. Keanu Reeves found out. He wrote personal checks. Not a single stunt team member went without their bonus that Christmas. None of them were asked to keep quiet about it. None of them were presented with a check attached to a photo opportunity. The check simply arrived. Several of those crew members did not speak about it publicly until years later, and only then because someone else had already started the story and they wanted to confirm it was true. There was the story from the production of the first Matrix film in 1999. The movie would go on to make over $460 million worldwide and change the visual language of action cinema in ways that film schools are still studying. Before any of that was known, when it was still just a wildly ambitious production with an uncertain future, Keanu had agreed to a significant portion of his back-end earnings going directly to the costume and special effects departments. The people who built the world that everyone else would get credit for inhabiting. The number, verified later by multiple sources, was in the region of $50 million. He did not announce this. He did not time the revelation to coincide with a press tour. It surfaced the way truth surfaces, when it is not being managed, gradually, through the people who were there. Charlene read. Darnell read over her shoulder. There was the story of the woman on the subway in New York City. A story that had been posted online by the woman herself, a teacher named Rosa Gilman from the Bronx, who described sitting across from a man she didn't immediately recognize on the downtown 6 train, holding grocery bags on her lap because the seat beside her was taken. The man across from her stood up at the next stop, even though he was clearly not getting off, and gestured to his seat. She took it. She didn't realize until 2 stops later, when the man smiled at her from the standing position, who he was. She said he looked slightly embarrassed to have been recognized, the way someone looks when they've done something small and private, and would have preferred it stayed that way. There was the story of the airport in Chicago. A woman named Diane Farthwell, a grief counselor from Naperville, Illinois, traveling home after her mother's funeral, wrote in a personal blog post in 2009 that she had been sitting alone in a terminal at O'Hare, crying in the specific exhausted way that people cry when they have been holding it together for days and can no longer find the reason to. A man sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer solutions or silver linings. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat there in the quiet way of someone who understood that presence was the thing, not words. After a while, she stopped crying, simply because she no longer felt alone. When she looked up, he was gone. The person at the next gate told her who it had been. She said she wasn't sure it mattered who it was. What mattered was that someone had sat down. Darnell had stopped reading and was just standing behind Charlene's chair, with his hands resting on the back of it, looking at the screen. The kitchen was quiet, except for the refrigerator's low hum and the distant sound of a dog somewhere on the block that had something to say about the evening. He could have said something this morning, Darnell said finally. One word, just his name. One word and I'd have known. Yes, Charlene said. He didn't. No, she said. He didn't. Darnell straightened up. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the lemon tree in the front yard, silver now in the early dark, heavy with fruit that kept coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. Why wouldn't he said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not self-pitying. He genuinely wanted to understand the mechanism of a person who had every tool available to make a situation go differently and chose not to use any of them. Charlene thought about it for a moment. Because he's been the person on the curb, she said. Not outside a studio, but somewhere, sometime, someone looked at him and saw less than what was there. And he remembers what that felt like. She paused. People who remember that feeling either spend their whole lives making sure it never happens to them again, or they spend their whole lives making sure they don't do it to anyone else. Darnell turned from the window. He chose the second one, he said. Seems like it, Charlene said. They stayed in the kitchen a while longer, the tea going cold, the laptop still open, the lemon tree doing what it always did outside the window. Quietly, generously, without needing anyone to notice. And Darnell Hutchins began, slowly and without fanfare, to think about the person he wanted to choose to be. There is a question that sits underneath this entire story, like a foundation beam that nobody sees but everything rests on. It is not, why didn't Keanu Reeves say his name? It is not, How does a man become famous enough that a producer runs across a parking lot for him and humble enough that a security guard doesn't recognize him in the same morning? The real question is this: how does a person absorb that much loss and come out the other side still soft? Because the timeline matters here. The specific placement of March 2006 on the map of Keanu Reeves's life is not incidental. It is everything. Ava Archer Syme Reeves had been gone for 6 years. 6 years since Christmas Eve 1999. 6 years since a name that had been a future became instead a weight, carried in silence through every public appearance, and every film set, and every morning that arrived without asking whether you were ready for it. Grief does not observe a statute of limitations. It does not file paperwork and close the case after a reasonable period. It lives in the body the way weather lives in old bones, not always present at the surface, but always there underneath, making itself known in quiet moments, in the specific sadness of certain kinds of light, in the weight of a Tuesday morning when nothing particular is wrong and everything is. Jennifer Syme had been gone for 5 years. 5 years since Cahuenga Boulevard. 5 years since 28 years old was the age at which her story stopped. On a street, in a city that kept moving around the fact of her absence, without pausing to acknowledge what had been lost. And yet, on the morning of March 14, 2006, Keanu Reeves took the metro to work. He walked the last several blocks because he liked the city at street level. He bought a coffee from Miguel's cart on the sidewalk outside the gate. He was told his name wasn't on the list, and he said no problem. He sat on a concrete step, and then a curb, and he waited with a paper cup between his hands, and he did not make the morning harder for anyone around him. Not for the gate assistant who delivered the news apologetically, not for Darnell Hutchins who did his job correctly with the information he had, not for Marcus Webb who came running across the parking lot with guilt written all over his face and apologies already forming in his mouth. He made it easier for all of them, without being asked. This is not a small thing. This is not basic decency dressed up as something profound. This is a specific and extraordinary choice made by a specific and extraordinarily tested person. Because the alternative was available to him. The anger was available. The ego was available. The quiet satisfaction of letting someone squirm for having underestimated you, that was available too, and it would have been understandable, and almost anyone else in that situation would have reached for some version of it. He reached for something else instead. Inside the meeting in Building 6 that morning, the room held 6 people. Marcus Webb at the head of the table. A director named Stephen Brower, who had 2 independent films to his name, and the particular intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time for a budget that matched his vision. A studio liaison. A senior script editor. And at the far end of the table, in the chair nearest the door that people at the far end of tables always get, the chair that signals you are present but not yet essential, sat Yuki Tanaka. Yuki was 26 years old. She had been in Los Angeles for 14 months, having moved from Portland, Oregon, where she had grown up the daughter of a Japanese-American botanist and a high school music teacher who between them had given her an unusually patient and unusually observant way of moving through the world. She had a film studies degree from Reed College and a fierce and carefully concealed terror that she had made a catastrophic mistake in coming to Hollywood, because 14 months in, and she was still the person in the room nearest the door. Her title was script coordinator. Her actual function was to be the organized memory of the production, tracking every draft, every revision, every note from every meeting, maintaining the chain of creative decisions, so that when someone said, "Didn't we change that in the 3rd revision?" Yuki was the one who could answer. It was important work. It was also almost entirely invisible work. In the 9 months she had been with Marcus Webb's production company, she had sat in approximately 40 meetings. She had been directly addressed in 3 of them, and 2 of those were to ask where the bathroom was. The meeting began. Marcus introduced Keanu. Briefly, with the slightly over-formal energy of a man still compensating for having sprinted across a parking lot 20 minutes ago. The director began talking about his vision for the film. The script editor had notes. The studio liaison had questions about the timeline. Keanu listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific and structural. The kind of questions that tell a room you have read the material carefully and thought about it away from the table. He was present in the way that people are present when they are genuinely interested rather than performing interest. And then, somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the emotional architecture of the second act, Keanu paused. He looked around the table. His eyes moved past Marcus, past the director, past the script editor and the studio liaison, and settled at the far end. "On Yuki, what do you think?" he said. The room recalibrated. It was subtle. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. But the air changed in the way air changes when something unexpected happens in an enclosed space. Yuki looked up from her notepad. She was not sure, for one suspended second, that she had been spoken to. She checked the geography of the room. She was the only person at that end of the table. He was looking directly at her. "Me?" she said. "You've read every draft," Keanu said. It was not a guess. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that made it feel like obvious logic. "You've watched this story change from the beginning. What does it feel like to you now?" Yuki Tanaka took a breath, and then she told him. She spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, about the way the emotional center of the story had shifted between drafts, about a specific scene in the second act that she thought was carrying too much narrative weight for what it was being asked to hold, about a small moment in the third act that she had always loved and was relieved had survived every revision. She spoke carefully at first, and then less carefully, as she realized that the attention coming from the far end of the table, from Keanu, and now from Marcus and Steven, who had recalibrated toward her, was real attention and not the polite performance of it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly right," Keanu said, simply, without elaboration. The way people confirm something when they already believed it and are relieved to hear it said out loud. Stephen Brower made a note. Marcus nodded slowly. The meeting moved forward. Yuki looked back down at her notepad. Her hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. Not from nerves, from something more complicated than nerves. From the specific feeling of having been seen in a room where invisibility had started to feel permanent. She would carry that feeling for the rest of her career. She would think about it years later when she was the one at the head of the table. She would think about it when she looked down to the far end and made a point, always, every meeting, without exception, of asking the person nearest the door what they thought. Because a man had sat on a curb one Tuesday morning and done nothing dramatic, had taken the metro and bought a coffee and waited without complaint, and walked into a meeting and asked a question that nobody else in the room had thought to ask. And without trying to, without announcing it, without any awareness that he was doing something that would ripple outward in ways he would never fully see, he had changed the direction of a young woman's life. The way Leonard from the community center in Etobicoke had once changed his. Though he didn't know that yet. That revelation was still waiting, the way the best ones always are. 3 weeks passed. The morning at Gate 2 settled into the category of things Darnell Hutchins thought about more than he discussed. He had told Charlene. He had told nobody else. Not his colleague Phil Okafor at the lobby desk, who had watched him run past that morning without explanation. Not his older brother Curtis, who called every Sunday from Sacramento and always asked how the job was going. Not the guys from his Thursday evening basketball group who met at the rec center on La Brea, even though nobody's knees were getting any younger. He kept it private the way people keep things private when the lesson inside them is still forming, and putting it into words too early might somehow damage the shape of it. But he thought about it. At the gate every morning when the first delivery vans came through, and the studio lot slowly filled with the organized noise of people making things. On the drive home, when the 110 moved slow, and the radio said nothing worth hearing. In the kitchen with Charlene, after dinner when the conversation ran out, and the comfortable silence moved in, he would find his mind going back to the curb, to the paper coffee cup, to the eyes that had looked up at him without heat. He had gone back to the stories on Charlene's laptop, twice more in the 3 weeks since. Read them more carefully the second time. Read between them the third time, looking not just at what Keanu had done, but at the pattern underneath, the stunt crews, the subway seat, the airport terminal, the $50 million that moved quietly from one set of hands to another without a press release or a charity gala or a single photograph of the moment. The pattern was not complicated once you could see it. It was simply this. Keanu Reeves paid attention to the people that the room was not paying attention to. And then he did something about it. Without calculation, without management, without needing the doing of it to be witnessed by anyone who could amplify it into something that reflected well on him. Darnell thought about his own life through that lens and found the image less comfortable than he would have liked. He was not a bad man. He knew that. He had worked hard and shown up reliably and treated people decently by most reasonable measures. But there was a difference, he was beginning to understand, between not being bad and actively being good. Between doing your job correctly and doing your job with the full weight of your attention on the human being in front of you, rather than the category you had placed them in. He had placed Keanu Reeves in a category in under 4 seconds. Man on steps, doesn't belong, move along. And the man had moved along without making Darnell pay for the error. Which was, somehow, more instructive than any confrontation could have been. On a Thursday afternoon in early April, 17 days after the morning at the gate, a production van came through Gate 2 on its way to the wardrobe department on the east side of the lot. Darnell checked the manifest the way he always did, waved it through. Routine. He glanced at the passenger window as the van passed. Keanu Reeves was sitting in the passenger seat. He was looking out the window at the lot, at the organized landscape of sound stages and equipment trucks and people moving with purpose across the asphalt, with the expression of someone who genuinely finds the machinery of filmmaking interesting. He was heading in for a costume fitting for the lake house. His hair was pulled back. He was wearing a plain gray shirt. He looked like a person, was the thing. Not a movie star preparing for the performance of being a movie star. Just a person in a van, looking out a window at a Tuesday morning. The van slowed slightly as it passed the gatehouse. Keanu turned from the window. He looked at Darnell. Darnell looked back at him. For 1 second, maybe 2, they held the look. The full weight of the morning 3 weeks ago sat in the space between them, unspoken, acknowledged by both, and spoken of by neither. Then Keanu smiled. Not a performance of a smile. Not the managed warmth that famous people deploy in public like a tool they've learned to use efficiently. A real one. Small and unhurried and genuine. The kind that reaches the eyes before it reaches the mouth. The kind that says, I see you in a register that has nothing to do with fame or gates, or paper coffee cups, or who was sitting on what curb on what morning. Then the van moved forward and was gone. Darnell stood at his post. He stood there after the van had disappeared around the corner, toward the wardrobe building, and he did not move for a moment that was longer than his professional composure would normally permit. Then he breathed. Something had passed between them that had no official name and required no further action from either party. An acknowledgement, a release, the quiet closing of something that had been left briefly, forgivably open. That evening, Darnell sat at the kitchen table with Charlene and a cup of coffee and the course catalog for West Los Angeles College, a community college 11 minutes from their house that he had driven past approximately 4,000 times in 9 years without once stopping to look at what was offered inside. He had looked it up online the previous weekend. He had looked at it again on Monday. He had printed the catalog on Tuesday and put it in his bag and carried it to work for 3 days without opening it, in the way people carry the things they are still deciding whether to be brave enough for. He opened it now on the kitchen table. There was a certificate program in film and television production management. 18 months. Evening classes twice a week so the day job stayed intact. The program covered budgeting, scheduling, crew management, production logistics, the architecture of how films actually got made, which Darnell had been watching up close for 11 years from the outside of a gate. He knew more than he realized. He had absorbed more than he had been given credit for, including by himself. Charlene watched him read. She did not say anything. She had learned, 19 years of marriage had taught her this with great thoroughness, that Darnell needed to arrive at his decisions from the inside out, and that the most useful thing she could do while he was arriving was stay present and not push. He read for a while. Then he looked up. "The application deadline is April 30th, he said. "That's 3 weeks away," Charlene said. "I know," she nodded. He looked back down at the catalog, at the photo on the program page that showed a group of students standing on what appeared to be a small film set. Someone holding a clapperboard, someone adjusting a light, everyone looking at something just outside the frame of the photograph, with the expression of people who are learning something they can feel will matter. "I'm 44 years old," he said. It was not a complaint. It was information he was laying on the table between them to examine honestly. "You are," Charlene agreed. "That's not too old," he said. This one was less certain, more of a question, wearing the clothes of a statement. Charlene reached across the table and put her hand over his. "A man sat on a curb outside your gate," she said quietly, "carrying more loss than most people will know in a lifetime, and got up without bitterness, and went inside, and asked the youngest person in the room what she thought." She paused. He didn't decide that was too much to ask of himself. He just did it. Darnell looked at her hand on his. "You think I should apply?" he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that you've been standing at that gate for 11 years, watching other people make things. And I think some part of you has always known you had more to offer than the watching." The kitchen was quiet. The lemon tree was dark outside the window. Somewhere down the block, the same dog from 3 weeks ago had something to say about the evening, and was saying it. Darnell Hutchins pulled the catalog closer. He found the page with the application instructions. He read it twice. Then he got up, found a pen in the drawer beside the stove, came back to the table, and began to fill out the first line. His name, his address, the date, April 7th, 2006. Small things. The way all real things begin. He did not know. As he sat at that kitchen table in the yellow house in Inglewood with Charlene's tea going cold beside him, and the pen moving across the form in his careful, unhurried handwriting, that the man who had sparked this moment was carrying his own unknowing. That Keanu Reeves had no idea that the security guard from Gate 2 was sitting 11 miles away deciding to become more than he had been. He also did not know, and this is the part that the story has been quietly building toward since the very first page, that the thread connecting Keanu Reeves to this moment, to this gate, to this city, to a young woman named Yuki Tanaka at the far end of a conference table, went back much further than a Tuesday morning in March. Went back, in fact, to a community center on Kipling Avenue in Etobicoke, Toronto, to a Thursday afternoon in the early 1980s, to a counselor named Leonard who told a quiet, struggling teenager something about silence that the teenager carried into every room he ever entered for the rest of his life, and to the question of who Leonard was, and who he was to Yuki, and why that changes everything about what this story actually is. There are stories that surprise you at the beginning, and there are stories that have been surprising you all along. Quietly, in the background, in the details you thought were decorative but were actually structural, and only reveal this at the end, when you look back and see that every thread was connected from the first sentence, and the pattern was always there, waiting for you to be ready to see it. This is the second kind of story. Go back to Etobicoke, Toronto, the early 1980s. A Thursday afternoon in November when the sky above the city was the particular gray that Lake Ontario produces in that season. Not threatening, just permanent. A low ceiling of cloud that makes the whole world feel closer together and slightly more honest than it does in summer. A community center on Kipling Avenue. Not a large building, not a well-funded one. The kind of place that exists because someone decided it should exist, and then spent years making that decision stick, through budget cuts and municipal indifference, and the general tendency of institutions to defund the things that matter most to the people with the least power to object. Inside, in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a bookshelf along one wall that held a collection of donated paperbacks in varying states of survival, a youth counselor named Leonard Tanaka ran a Thursday afternoon program for teenagers who were falling through the gaps. Leonard was 43 years old in 1982. He was a quiet man, Japanese-American, second generation, raised in Vancouver and transplanted to Toronto in his late 20s by a job offer and a woman he loved, in that order. He had a degree in social work from the University of British Columbia, and a natural gift for the specific skill that no degree can fully teach: the ability to sit with a young person in their difficulty without trying to fix it before it was ready to be fixed. To simply be present in the space beside the pain until the person inside it found their own way to the surface. He worked with kids who had learning differences, kids from fractured homes, kids who had been moved around so many times that belonging had started to feel like a word in a language they were losing fluency in. Kids for whom Thursday afternoon at this underfunded community center on Kipling Avenue was the most consistent thing in a week that otherwise shifted under their feet. One of those kids was a 15-year-old boy with dark hair and dyslexia, and a father who had been gone for 12 years and eyes that were extraordinarily still for someone so young. He came in on Thursdays after school. He didn't talk much at first. He sat at the back of the room and watched the other kids with the careful attention of someone who has learned that watching is safer than participating until you understand the rules. Leonard watched him back, not intrusively, not with the clinical assessment gaze that makes young people feel like subjects rather than people, just the gentle, consistent attention of someone who has time and is willing to spend it. After 3 weeks, the boy started talking, slowly at first, about hockey, about how the words on the page moved when he tried to read them, about his mother who worked hard and moved them often, and loved him in the practical, determined way of someone who doesn't have time to be sentimental, but makes sure you are fed and housed, and reminded that you matter, even when the evidence is confusing. About his father, about the specific silence where a father should be. Leonard listened to all of it. He brought books with pictures. He introduced the boy to a local theater director named Greta Marsh, who ran a youth drama program 2 nights a week, in a church basement on Bloor Street. He did the quiet architectural work of a good counselor, not building the life for the young person, but locating the materials and making sure they were within reach. And one Thursday afternoon, in the winter of 1982, near the end of a session when the other kids had gone and the boy was putting on his coat to leave, Leonard said something. He hadn't planned it. It arrived the way true things sometimes arrive, not from the thinking mind, but from somewhere deeper and more reliable. He looked at the boy who was always watching, always listening, always present in his silence, in a way that the loud kids in the room never quite were, and he said, "The quietest people in the room are the ones who felt the most. Don't ever mistake quiet for empty." The boy stopped with one arm in his coat sleeve. He looked at Leonard. He didn't say anything, which was, given the context, exactly right. He finished putting on his coat. He picked up his bag. He nodded once, the way he always nodded when something had landed. Not a social nod, not a polite acknowledgement, but the real kind that comes from somewhere behind the eyes. He walked out into the gray Toronto afternoon. Leonard never knew in the weeks and months that followed whether those words had meant anything. Young people don't always tell you when something lands. Sometimes they carry things for years before the weight of them becomes visible. He continued running the Thursday program. The boy came back for another 6 months before his mother moved them again, and the sessions ended without formal conclusion, the way many things in that boy's life ended, not with a goodbye, but with an absence that arrived quietly one week and then stayed. Leonard Tanaka thought about that boy occasionally over the years, not obsessively, the way you think about the ones you hope made it through. He continued his work on Kipling Avenue. The building got a new coat of paint in 1989, and new folding chairs in 1994, and a small grant from the city in 1998 that allowed him to hire a part-time assistant. He married a woman named Setsuko in 1985, and they had 2 children, a son named David, who became an engineer in Waterloo, and a daughter named Reiko, who married a botanist from Portland, Oregon, and moved to the Pacific Northwest, and eventually had a daughter of her own. A daughter named Yuki Tanaka, who grew up in Portland hearing stories about her grandfather Leonard, the way children absorb family mythology, not always in sequence, not always in full detail, but in the specific atmospheric way that the important parts of a person's character get transmitted across generations. She knew he worked with young people. She knew he believed in the kind of listening that most people were too busy or too frightened to practice. She knew he had a saying, a specific one, that her mother Reiko quoted at dinner tables and in car rides, and in the particular moments when Yuki needed to hear something true. The quietest people in the room are the ones who felt the most. Don't ever mistake quiet for empty. Yuki had grown up with those words the way some people grow up with Bible verses or family mottos, so embedded in the texture of ordinary life that they stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like just the way things were. She had carried them to Reed College. She had carried them to Los Angeles. She had carried them into every meeting where she sat at the far end of the table nearest the door and watched the loud people talk and waited for someone to notice that the quiet ones were also present. She was carrying them on the morning of March 14, 2006, when she sat in the conference room in Building 6 at Paramount Studios, and a man at the other end of the table looked past the director and the producer and the studio liaison and found her at the end and asked what she thought. She had told him, and he had said that's exactly right in the tone of someone confirming something they already believed. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could have known, was why it felt so natural, why his attention had found her so precisely, why his question had landed so accurately on the specific nature of what she had been thinking and feeling and quietly holding for 14 months in a city that hadn't yet learned her name. It was not coincidence. It was not Hollywood magic or narrative convenience, or the satisfying tidiness of a story that has been shaped for maximum emotional effect. It was simpler than any of that. And more profound. A man named Leonard Tanaka had sat with a struggling 15-year-old boy on Thursday afternoons in a community center on Kipling Avenue in Etobicoke and taught him, without ever using the word taught, that silence was not absence, that the quietest person in the room was worth turning toward, that paying attention to the ones being overlooked was not charity, it was accuracy. The boy had grown up. He had ridden a motorcycle to Los Angeles. He had made films that made the world stop and stare. He had lost a daughter and a love, and kept showing up anyway. He had sat on a curb outside a studio gate on a Tuesday morning in March and waited, without bitterness, for the world to correct its small mistake. And then he had walked into a conference room and looked to the far end of the table, because Leonard had taught him to. And Yuki was there because Leonard was her grandfather, and she had spent her whole life being told, in the precise words her grandfather had given a quiet teenager in 1982, that quiet was not empty. She had walked into that conference room already knowing she was worth listening to. She had just been waiting for someone who knew it too. When Yuki called her mother Reiko that evening from her apartment in Silver Lake, a small place with a fire escape she used as a reading balcony and a view of the hills that made the rent almost justifiable. She told her about the meeting. About the man at the other end of the table, who had looked past everyone else, and asked her what she thought. About how it had felt to be seen in a room where she had started to believe she was furniture. Reiko listened. Then she said, "That sounds like someone your grandfather would have liked." Yuki laughed. "Yeah," she said, "it does." She didn't think more of it than that. A good meeting, a kind man, a moment of grace in an industry not famous for producing them. 3 days later, Reiko called her mother Setsuko in Toronto. A Sunday call, routine, the kind that holds a family together across distance, and mentioned the story. Setsuko told Leonard that evening over dinner. A man at Yuki's studio job, famous apparently, kind in the specific way that Leonard had always said was the hardest kind to maintain, asked Yuki her opinion in a room full of more important people. Leonard set down his fork. "What was his name?" he said. Setsuko thought, "Keanu something, an actor." Reiko said he was quite famous. Leonard was quiet for a moment. He was 71 years old. He still went into the community center on Kipling Avenue 3 days a week. The building had new windows now, and the folding chairs had been replaced again. There were new kids, different faces, same essential needs, the same hunger to be told that the difficult parts of them were not disqualifications but materials. He thought about a boy in a coat with one arm in the sleeve, about gray November light on Kipling Avenue, about the specific still quality of a pair of dark eyes that had absorbed something true and carried it out into a Thursday afternoon without a word. He picked up his fork again. "He learned it somewhere," he said quietly. Setsuko looked at him. He was smiling, not a large smile, not a performed one, the small private kind, the kind that lives on the face of someone who has just understood that something they sent out into the world a very long time ago has been traveling all this time, passing from person to person like a warm thing handed forward, and has arrived somewhere good. He learned it somewhere, he said again, and left it at that. Because Leonard Tanaka had spent 50 years understanding that the most important things do not need to be explained. They only need to be passed on. Here is what the newspapers got wrong. Not because they lied, but because the truth of this story is wider than any headline can hold, and headlines by their nature must choose edge to stand on and call that edge the whole thing. So the version that circulated, famous actor mistaken for vagrant outside Hollywood studio, producer comes running, security guard mortified, is accurate the way a photograph of a river is accurate. It captures a moment. It cannot capture the current. The current is this. A man named Leonard Tanaka sat in a room with fluorescent lights on Thursday afternoons in Etobicoke and believed, without evidence, without guarantee, without any mechanism by which belief could be verified before it was too late to matter, that the quiet ones were worth turning toward. He did this for decades. He did it for kids whose names he sometimes forgot, and whose faces stayed with him long after the names had gone. He did it without a documentary being made about him, and without a building named in his honor, and without the kind of recognition that the world tends to reserve for the people who do their good work, loudly enough to be heard from a distance. He did it because it was true, because the quietest people in the room had felt the most, because mistaking quiet for empty was a category of error he had decided, somewhere in his early 20s, that he would spend his life correcting. A boy carried that out of a community center on Kipling Avenue one Thursday in the winter of 1982 and rode it, eventually, improbably, on a motorcycle, all the way to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, the boy became a man who lost things that cannot be replaced and kept showing up anyway, who gave away money the way most people give away compliments, privately, without expecting it returned, almost embarrassed to be caught doing it, who sat on a curb outside a studio gate and waited without bitterness, because waiting without bitterness was something he had been practicing since he was 3 years old, and a door closed behind a man who should have stayed. He walked into a conference room and looked to the far end of the table, because Leonard had taught him that the far end of the table was where the real information lived. A young woman named Yuki Tanaka received that attention like water receives light, completely, without resistance, changed by the contact in ways that would take years to fully understand. She went on. She built a career in the industry that had initially made her invisible. She sat at the head of tables eventually. She always, without exception, looked to the far end, because her grandfather had told her mother, who had told her that quiet was not empty, and a man she had met once in a conference room had confirmed it in the most direct way possible, by looking directly at her when everyone else was looking elsewhere. A security guard named Darnell Hutchins drove home on the 110 South and sat at a kitchen table in Inglewood, with a course catalog and a pen, and the specific courage that arrives, not as a feeling of readiness, but as a decision made in the absence of readiness. He applied to a certificate program at West Los Angeles College before the April 30th deadline. He attended the first class on a Tuesday evening in September 2006, sat in the third row, and wrote his name at the top of the first page of a new notebook, in the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who understood that beginning late was not the same as beginning wrong. He finished the program in 2008. He spent 2 more years at the Paramount Gate, not marking time, but watching differently now, with the eyes of someone who understood from the inside what the machinery he was guarding was actually doing. In 2010, he transitioned to a production assistant role on an independent film shooting on the lot. He was 48 years old. Nobody gave him a speech about it. Nobody wrote an article. He simply walked through a different door on the same lot he had been guarding for 13 years and started learning what came next. By 2015, he had a production credit on a short film that screened at a small festival in Burbank. Charlene sat in the 4th row of a theater that held 90 people and watched her husband's name appear on a screen for the first time. She did not cry during the film. She cried in the car on the way home, quietly, facing the window so he wouldn't feel obligated to address it. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He just drove. He had learned that too, from a man on a curb who understood that presence was sometimes the whole of what was needed. Darnell has never met Keanu Reeves again. He does not know if Keanu remembers the morning at Gate 2. He suspects not because Keanu is careless with experience, but because a man who absorbs the world as quietly and completely as Keanu Reeves does accumulate so many moments of grace, given and received, that no single Tuesday morning could reasonably be expected to stay lit in the memory among all the others. Darnell does not need it to. He said this once to Charlene, several years after the morning at the gate, on an evening when they were sitting on the concrete porch of the yellow house, watching the lemon tree do what it always did, producing more than was needed, quietly, without being asked. "I don't need him to know," Darnell said. "It's enough that I do." Charlene looked at the lemon tree. "That's the whole lesson," she said. And it is. This is the real story. Not the famous actor on the curb. Not the producer running across the parking lot. Not even the beautiful hidden geometry of Leonard Tanaka's words, traveling from a community center in Toronto to a conference room in Los Angeles, through 2 people who never knew they were carrying the same thing. The real story is what goodness does when it is not performing, when it is simply moving through the world in worn boots and a faded jacket, buying coffee from a sidewalk cart, sitting on a curb without complaint, asking the youngest person in the room what they think. The real story is what happens in the years after, in the kitchens and the classrooms and the small film festivals in Burbank, and the phone calls between Portland and Toronto on Sunday evenings. In all the rooms where someone looks to the far end of the table, because once, in a different room, someone looked to the far end and found them. The real story is always the ripple, not the stone. Keanu Reeves was treated like a beggar outside a studio. He responded like someone who had been taught, by loss, by absence, by a counselor named Leonard on a Thursday afternoon in 1982, that your worth is not located in what other people can see. It is located in what you do when they cannot, in how you hold the coffee cup, in whether you make the morning harder or easier for the people around you, in whether when someone finally asks the youngest person in the room what they think, the youngest person has been living, from childhood, from bedtime stories, from the words of someone who cared enough to say them, inside the knowledge that they are worth asking. Leonard Tanaka sat down to breakfast on a Sunday morning in Toronto in the spring of 2006. He was 71 years old. The windows in the community center on Kipling Avenue had been replaced. The folding chairs were new. There were fresh kids on Thursday afternoons with the same essential hunger. To be seen, to be told that the complicated parts of them were not mistakes but materials. To hear from someone who had no obvious reason to lie that quiet was not the same as empty. He poured his tea. He thought about a boy with one arm in a coat sleeve, standing in the doorway of a room with fluorescent lights, absorbing something true before walking out into a gray November afternoon. He thought about his granddaughter in Los Angeles, sitting at the far end of a conference table, being asked her opinion by a man at the other end who had learned, somewhere, somehow, from someone, to look in that direction. He did not know the circle was complete. He did not need to. He picked up his tea and drank it while it was warm, and thought about which of the Thursday kids needed the most attention this week, and what materials he had available to help them build whatever they were in the process of becoming. This is what legacy looks like when it is not trying to look like anything. This is what it means to pass something on. A curb, a coffee cup, a question asked to the youngest person in the room, a pen moving across an application form on a kitchen table in Inglewood, a name in the credits of a short film in Burbank, a granddaughter who became the person at the head of the table who always looks to the far end, a 71-year-old man drinking tea in Toronto who will never know the full shape of what he built because the full shape extends far beyond what any one life can see from where it stands. And somewhere in all of it, on a motorcycle, on a subway, on a curb, in a conference room, at an airport terminal beside a woman who needed someone to simply sit down, a man who was told at 15 that he was rare and spent the rest of his life proving it, in every direction except the one where someone might have noticed and written it down. Until now. And that is the story of a man who had every reason to be bitter and chose, every single day, in every single room, on every single curb, to be kind instead. So before you go, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your country, wherever you are in the world, right down there in the comments. We read every single one. And there is something truly special about seeing how far these stories travel. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the way you see the quiet person in the room, or the stranger on the curb, or the youngest one at the table who nobody is asking, then do something simple right now. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that stories like this one matter to you. And if you believe the world gets a little better every time kindness gets more attention than drama, then subscribe to this channel, because that is exactly what we are here to do. Every single video. Find the stories that remind us what people are actually capable of when nobody is watching. Spread this one. Share it with someone who needs it today. You probably already know exactly who that person is. And right now, on your screen, there is another story waiting for you. Click it. We promise it is worth your time. We will see you there.